Hello. The episode you're about to listen to is part of a multi-part series introducing an overview of Japanese history. This is a repeat of one of the original projects the History of Japan podcast was built on, and is intended to serve as an update and supplement to these original works. After 10 years, my hope is to return to this approach and to do it a little bit better given the skills that I have improved in the intervening years. If you haven't been doing so already, you should listen to these episodes sequentially, starting with episode 501. Without any further ado, enjoy the episode. Hello, and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 512, The New Buddhisms. Today we're going to put a brief pin in the story of warrior government in Japan to talk about a massive change in the world of Japanese religion, the effects of which profoundly reshaped the religious map of the country. Up until this point, Buddhism, one of the world's foremost religions, spanning the Asian continent and with a history going back, at the point we've arrived to chronologically, a millennium and a half, was mostly an elite religion in Japan. As we've covered, there were attempts to missionize to the Japanese masses, but these were few and far between. And while the two dominant sects of Buddhism in Japan by the time of the Genpei War, Tendai and Shingon, rejected the notion that you had to be born into a high social status to attain enlightenment, their focus on esoteric secret practices that most working people would not have the time or money for meant that Buddhism remained largely an elite religion. But over the course of what we might call the early medieval era in Japan, three new sects would arrive from China or emerge domestically, which would challenge the elite grip on Buddhism, and begin the practice of democratizing the faith, so to speak, and spreading its influence into wider Japanese society. These three sects are Zen, Pure Land, and Nichiren Buddhism, and today is going to be about walking through the history and importance of each. We're going to start with Zen, a sect so strongly associated with Japan and Japanese identity that it's almost certainly the first thing people think of when they think of Japanese Buddhism. And yet Zen's origins are distinctly not Japanese. Zen is originally from China. The idea of Zen Buddhism being fundamentally Japanese is a very modern one, based on concerted effort during the 20th century among Japanese Zen practitioners, most famously Daisetsu Teitaro Suzuki, to spread awareness of Zen in the US and Europe. By comparison, the practitioners of Chan, the Chinese progenitors of Zen, never really got their PR together in the same way, though, to be fair, the 20th century was rather rough for Chinese religious institutions in general, so they had other things to keep them busy, I'm sure. Anyway, Chan and Zen are Chinese and Japanese readings of the same character, which is in turn a contraction of a longer term Channa, or Zenna. That word is derived from dhyana, a word in Sanskrit, the language of Indian Buddhism, and really Indian philosophy and religion more generally, which means meditation. The origins of Zen, which is just the word I'm going to use going forward, are a bit historically murky. The sect began to emerge with a distinctive identity sometime around the 5th century, during the periods of war and chaos that predated the rise of China's Sui and Tang dynasties. Its origins are associated with a quasi-mythic figure named Bodhidharma, or Daruma in Japanese, a monk from the West who came to spread Buddhism in China. He's often thought to either be Persian or Afghani, and is depicted with a big nose, bushy eyebrows, and blue eyes, and an intense temper. In particular, Bodhidharma is famous for his impatience with the elaborate trappings of Buddhist practice, and an emphasis on simple yet rigorous meditative practices. After he came to China, Bodhidharma would take several students there, the most famous of whom was a monk named Huike. There's all kinds of great stories about Bodhidharma and Huike, the most famous being that Bodhidharma initially refused to take him as a student until Huike cut his own arm off to prove his sincerity. To be fair, Bodhidharma was setting a pretty strict example for him, One of the many legends about the man himself is that he cut his own eyelids off to prevent himself from falling asleep while meditating, and that the first tea leaves grew from the discarded bits. Huike would eventually become Bodhidharma's chosen successor, establishing a lineage of Zen patriarchs. One of the core ideas of Zen is Dharma transmission, the idea that Zen is so complicated that you can only learn it from a master rather than by, say, reading about it or listening to a podcast or practicing on your own. Once you have attained enlightenment, you are marked as having received the transmission of the Dharma, the teaching of Zen, which entitles you to take your own students and serves to authenticate you, so to speak, as a practitioner. The lineages can get complicated, particularly once Zen starts to grow and fracture into competing lineages, but they all trace back to Bodhidharma and his 6 immediate successors, the 6 patriarchs of Zen, and from there back to Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha himself. In essence, they create a sort of Buddhist genealogy, allowing you to trace your teaching all the way back to the origins of Buddhism. I do think it's important to note here, though, that there are a lot of historical questions around Bodhidharma and his successors, and not a lot of sources about them, and what we do have describes some pretty unbelievable stuff, as I just mentioned. All we can really say for certain is that Zen emerged from a combination of Buddhist ideas brought by monks like Bodhidharma and existing Chinese religious traditions, most notably the radical skeptical views associated with Taoism. Regardless, by the 700s, Zen had emerged onto the Chinese religious stage as one of a series of competing Buddhist sects, the Tang dynasty of China being a real period of flourishing for Buddhism. Which takes us, I suppose, to the question of what differentiates Zen from other forms of Buddhism. As the root of the name in the word for meditation implies, Zen as a discipline is primarily focused on intense meditative practice. What form this meditation takes can vary a great deal based on teaching and lineage, but the emphasis is always on rigorous mental discipline, which is cultivated internally. That mental discipline, in turn, is geared towards radically reimagining your own relationship to the world. Zen is extremely iconoclastic, a fancy way of saying it rejects a lot of the categories and ideas we take as givens. This would include, for example, attacking the notion that you and I are separate beings, or that there is any clear line we can draw between the two of us, or between you and the context you exist in more broadly. The way I've always thought of it is that rather than discrete individuals or specific phenomena, Zen imagines the world as an interconnected series of nodes of cause and effect, each of us acting on and being acted upon by others, both changing in response to our circumstances and being changed by them. This realization in turn leads to the understanding that all of us already have a fundamental Buddha nature. We have the potential of Buddhas within us, connected as we are to the Buddhas and everything else by that web of cause and effect. Enlightenment, then, is not really something you attain, but something you realize you already have. All of this relies, again, on meditation, which rejects explicitly the complex ritual trappings of other forms of Buddhism. Hopefully this gives you some idea of the complexity of the belief system, and I should note here that I'm trying to explain a sect of Buddhism that is not only complicated, but in many ways resistant to intellectual analysis, since that analysis tends to reinforce the categorical distinctions that Zen sees as irrelevant. Zen also bills itself as being beyond transmission by words, which are a fundamentally flawed medium for understanding such complex notions, and also I'm up to about 8 minutes of podcast time, so I'm simplifying a lot here. I hope any Zen practitioners listening are not offended by my attempts to do justice to a fascinating and absolutely mind-bending intellectual tradition, and really, if you're at all interested in Buddhism, I encourage you to read more about Zen. It's absolutely fascinating. Japanese monks, who often made pilgrimages to the Asian mainland to study Buddhism with their continental counterparts, had already encountered Zen by the mid-Tang dynasty, but the reception was decidedly mixed. The 9th century monk Ennin, upon meeting a group of Zen monastics, called them, quote, extremely unruly men at heart, unquote, probably a comment upon the gleeful rejection of much of the doctrine of other Buddhist sects. Still, Ennin's reaction was not universal. For example, Saicho, the founder of Japan's Tendai sect, did study Zen well in China in the early 800s and incorporated some of its ideas into what became Tendai sect doctrine. In later years, more unorthodox Tendai monks would attempt to incorporate Zen's ideas around universal Buddha nature into Tendai doctrine, though they would never succeed in getting the more conservative leadership of the sect to go along with it. And at any rate, starting in 894, the Kyoto imperial court began to drastically curtail its official missions to China, both because of the cost and because of the faltering power of the Tang dynasty, which would collapse just 13 years later. Without those missions, there was a lot less contact between the Japanese and Chinese Buddhist establishments. It was not until the age of the Minamoto/Hojo rulers of the Kamakura shogunate that Zen would really begin to find its footing in Japan. In part, this was due to an increasingly receptive religious establishment in Japan. In the intervening centuries, the growing wealth of the major temples had led to widespread corruption, with abbots and monks living more like aristocrats than monastics. That, in combination with the violence of the late Heian era, all those wars we just spent so much time talking about, led to a growing consensus that Japan had entered the age of Mappo, the decline of Buddhist law. And here, we need to talk a bit about Buddhist theology more broadly. A very simplified, though not completely inaccurate reading of Buddhism would be that it's about the idea that nothing in the world is permanent, and that includes Buddhism itself. In this view, the early years of Buddhism were a period of Shobo, the correct law, when Buddha's disciples were able to correctly transmit his teaching. However, things get distorted over time, as anyone who's ever played the game Telephone can tell you, and over the years, Buddhism eventually transitioned to an age of Zoho, the semblance of the law, where the teachings had been modified to an extent, but everything was more or less on the right track. However, the corruption of the Buddhist establishment and the strife of Japanese politics clearly indicated another transition to the final age, Mappo, or declining law. By this time, the teachings of the Buddha had been so mangled that salvation by traditional means was no longer possible. This degeneracy would eventually be dealt with. Mahayana Sutras promised the coming of a new Buddha who would begin the cycle again, known in Sanskrit as Maitreya or Miroku in Japanese. However, in the meantime, aspirants for enlightenment would have to get creative with their methods and be open to some new ideas. And so many a monk of Kamakura, Japan went looking to the natural place for new ideas, China, which after all was the heart of Mahayana Buddhism. And what they found over the past few centuries was that this new sect, Chan or Zen, had come to dominate China's religious landscape. The sect had outcompeted pretty much all comers and was far and away the most vital and dominant part of the national religious landscape. Its intellectual novelty was impressive. The monks engaged in vigorous and lively debate, as well as the study of complex gongan or koan in Japanese, short but enormously complex anecdotes intended to guide someone towards enlightenment in an abstract way. The monks also engaged in secular artistic and cultural pursuits like painting and poetry, both as a way to express their religious views and as a way to connect with the secular world. All of this was very appealing, and so starting in the mid-1100s with monks like Eisai and Kakua, Japanese Buddhist monks began trying to take what they'd learned back home to Japan. Both Eisai and Kakua were originally trained as Tendai sect monks and hoped not to found a new sect, but to incorporate the Zen teachings they'd learned about in China to revitalize Tendai. However, they found the leadership of the Tendai establishment to be hostile to those innovations. And here, the paths of the two men diverged substantially. Kakua was apparently a great showman. He was invited to speak to Emperor Takakura about what he'd learned of Buddhism, but responded to the emperor's questions about Zen theology by pulling out a flute and playing a melody. Amusing, but not likely to get you very far. He was, shockingly enough, not very successful in establishing an enduring lineage or winning students. Eisai, on the other hand, left Kyoto and went east. He received an invitation from none other than Hojo Masako to share what he learned in China among the Kamakura Eastern warriors, and there he found a very receptive audience. Going forward, much of the elite of Japan's warrior class would have at least some interest in Eisai's branch of Zen, the Linji school or Rinzai in Japanese. With Masako's patronage, Eisai was eventually able to go back to Kyoto and found his own temple, Kenninji, to be the headquarters of his new sect. Rinzai would be the dominant school among the elite of the warrior class for the next several centuries. The other figure associated with early Zen in Japan is Dogen, a generation or so younger than Eisai, but also originally a Tendai sect monk. Not satisfied with Tendai doctrine, he would eventually relocate to Kenninji to study with Eisai, and in 1223 he went to China alongside Eisai's senior-most student, Myozen. There he would connect with an elderly and austere master of the Caodong school, a separate lineage from Eisai's Linji/Rinzai school, named Rujing. Dogen would spend 5 years studying with Rujing until his master was on his deathbed, and just before his death, Rujing recognized Dogen's enlightenment and transmitted the teachings of the Caodong school to him. Upon his return to Japan, Dogen would eventually leave Kenninji and the Rinzai sect, which he saw as having swerved away from a single-minded focus on meditation. His own sect, known as Soto in Japanese, would instead find its base in remote Echizen, where Dogen would relocate and found Eiheiji. Soto would never attain the same level of patronage or recognition as Rinzai, but that would turn out to be one of its biggest strengths. A few episodes down the line, we'll see Rinzai lose its exclusive warrior elite patronage, which in turn would see their following shrink dramatically. Soto's support was more organic, for lack of a better term, and so it never suffered the same setbacks, and today it is the largest school of Zen in Japan. Now, there's a lot more we could say here about the relationship between Rinzai and Soto, but we have two other denominations to get to, and I want to do them justice too. Which brings us to Pure Land Buddhism and the figure of Honen. Like Dogen and Eisai before him, Honen was originally a Tendai sect monk from Enryakuji, the enormously wealthy Tendai sect temple atop Mount Hiei just northeast of Kyoto, which had become something of a hotbed of religious reformism during this period. Honen was from about a generation or so earlier than them. He was born in the 1130s to a provincial family in Mimasaka province, now northern Okayama prefecture on the western end of Honshu. This was, to put it somewhat unkindly, the middle of nowhere. Mimasaka is a rural area far from the center of power at Kyoto, and the only way for someone from a family so removed from the aristocracy to break into the nation's elite was via the priesthood, which is exactly the route Honen took after his father's death in a political dispute caused him to turn to religion. Honen spent 30 years at Mount Hiei primarily as a student of one of its more oddball monks, Eiku, a master famous for distancing himself from the intense politics of the wealthy temple and living on a more isolated part of Mount Hiei, and for expounding some rather unusual doctrines. Honen was drawn to Eiku, but also received a more traditional Tendai sect theology education, as well as studying with the Hosso sect monks of Nara. What really clicked with Honen, however, was an experience about 30 years into his monastic career, when his studies brought him to a text called the Guan Wu Liang Shou Jingshu, or Kanmu Ryoju Kyo in Japanese, the commentary on the Contemplation Sutra by the 7th century Chinese monk Shandao. Shandao was an exponent of a Buddhist tradition known as Amidism, a different sort of answer to the problem of Mappo, which centers the figure of the Amida Buddha. Amida, or Amitabha in Sanskrit, is one of the many Buddhas of the Buddhist tradition, who, during his journey to enlightenment, made 48 vows related to his mission, to save all sentient beings from the cycle of death and rebirth before leaving that cycle and attaining nirvana himself. That mission would involve the construction of a Pure Land, sometimes also called a Buddha field, free from the corruption of this world, where adherents to his teachings could learn directly from him. Of his 48 vows, the 18th is the most important, which is why it's often called the principal vow or hongan in Japanese. That vow states that, quote, if the beings of the 10 quarters who, after having heard my name, and thus awakened their highest faith and aspiration of rebirth in that country of mine, Even if they have recollected such a thought for 10 times only, they are destined to be reborn there. In other words, faith in Amida's vows alone is enough to be reborn into this pure land and thus attain enlightenment. The 19th vow, meanwhile, promises that Amida will appear at the moment of death to said faithful to usher them along to his Pure Land. All of this is explained in the original Contemplation Sutra. The text Honen read was Shandao's commentary on that sutra, and Shandao read out from Amida's vows that the only thing necessary for rebirth in Amida's Pure Land was an expression of faith. He codified that expression as the phrase, "I take refuge in the Amida Buddha." Inspired by Shandao's teachings, Honen began to expound the same doctrine, that this simple declaration of faith, called the Nenbutsu, and directly transliterated from the original Chinese as Namu Amida Butsu, was the key to enlightenment. Earlier sects like Tendai had incorporated bits of Amidist/Pure Land theology into their own doctrine, but Honen's formulation was different. He said that it was the only thing necessary for attaining enlightenment. And I think this can be challenging to wrap your head around in terms of how revolutionary it really is. Even the doctrinal shifts of Tendai and Shingon, with their emphasis on the idea that anyone could attain enlightenment, still there was this idea that enlightenment had to be sought with an intense religious lifestyle, which in practice was only open to the elite. Honen's chant, by contrast, could be done by anyone. You didn't even have to be literate enough to read a sutra, let alone join a monastery. You just had to know the words and chant them with sincerity. Obviously, this teaching created a bit of a stir, and Honen spent a good chunk of his career defending himself from attacks by his monastic colleagues, who accused him of, in essence, oversimplifying Buddhism to the point of unrecognizability. Honen defended himself in several written works in which he argued that Buddhist doctrine really was just that simple. Amida had made his vow to save all who had faith, and understanding Amida's compassion and having faith in it was all you had to do. All other Buddhist doctrine was fundamentally an unnecessary distraction from this core idea, and indeed, in an age of Mappo, it was dangerous, since it was no longer possible to attain salvation by yourself in such a degenerate world. Honen in turn would find one of his most devoted followers in a member of the lower Kyoto aristocracy by the name of Shinran, about 30 years his junior and born into a minor offshoot of the Fujiwara. His parents died when he was young, inspiring Shinran to an interest in religion as he wished to know what happens after death. This in turn brought him where else but Mount Hiei, but he too was not satisfied with Tendai sect doctrine. In 1201, he began a period of religious seclusion that ended in a nighttime revelation, which in turn brought him to Honen. Shinran became, according to himself, one of Honen's most single-minded and devoted disciples. How close their relationship was is a matter of some historiographical dispute. In 1207, Honen expelled one of his other disciples, named Kosai, for advocating a doctrine too extreme even for him, that one needed to recite the Nenbutsu only once to be saved, and asked his followers to sign a 7-article pledge to avoid conduct which would openly scandalize the other sects of Buddhism. Shinran's name is on that pledge, but it appears not at the top with the rest of the inner circle, instead he's somewhere in the middle. Regardless, the relationship would not be a terribly long one. In 1207, Kyoto would be racked with yet another scandal when 2 of Honen's followers were accused of taking mistresses against the monastic vow of celibacy, and telling the mistresses that this was a non-issue because of the salvatory power of the Nenbutsu. This scandal was big enough that the Kamakura shogunate itself stepped in, taking a break from a fun stretch of intra-family rivalry and murder to ban the Nenbutsu practice in Kyoto and exile all of Honen's followers, because taking mistresses, that sort of thing just reflects poorly on a person's character, as opposed to, say, murdering your own grandchildren. Anyway, all of Honen's followers, including Shinran, were exiled to different provinces, as was the man himself. Honen and Shinran would never meet again. When the exile order was finally lifted, Honen would return to Kyoto and die there in 1212, while Shinran would never go back. Instead, he remained in the countryside, First in his destination for exile, Echigo province or modern Niigata prefecture on the Japan Sea coast, and then after he was pardoned, Hitachi province, more or less Ibaraki prefecture north of Tokyo. In the countryside, Shinran continued to proselytize for his Pure Land teachings, and in a very unorthodox way. He stopped calling himself a monk and openly took a wife, living in essence as a humble peasant farmer while also preaching to the local population, in essence trying to remove any separation between himself and his followers, and embracing the idea that the Nenbutsu was the only valid path to salvation, and thus the trappings of monastic life were unnecessary or even a hindrance. Shinran's theology also began to differ in small but key ways from that of Honen. Honen treated the Nenbutsu as, in essence, a repetitive religious ritual one must perform to attain salvation. In essence, the performance of the Nenbutsu would slowly accumulate merit to your future salvation. For Shinran, the merits were more immediate. He believed the first time you uttered it with real faith, your salvation was assured. From that point forward, any future recitation of the Nenbutsu was an expression of gratitude for salvation already achieved, and a reflection of your calm state of mind in this world, knowing that you are, in essence, already saved. Basically, your faith in Amida alone is enough. Enlightenment is not really necessary because you will be reborn in Amida's Pure Land, and obviously attain enlightenment there. Shinran also extended Honen's belief in Mappo towards the conclusion that humans were fundamentally incapable of anything other than negative action. Thus, in an age of Mappo, faith in Amida was the only path to enlightenment, as any other effort would be insufficient. Someone with a better background in comparative theology probably could, or already has, put together an interesting comparison of this with, say, Calvinism, but that's not really anywhere close to my wheelhouse. Shinran would eventually return to Kyoto 30 years down the line and spent the final part of his life there, remaining in contact with his disciples in the Kanto Plains, but steadfastly refusing their attempts to put him up as the leader of a new sect and insisting on the fundamental equality of all before the Amida Buddha. Despite his disinterest in sectarianism, Shinran's later followers and disciples would eventually morph into a Buddhist sect all their own. Honen's followers would come to call themselves members of Jodoshu, or the Pure Land sect. Shinran's, in a clever piece of branding, would come to call themselves Jodo Shinshu, or the True Pure Land sect. Both of these sects are still around today, but the True Pure Land sect is far and away the larger. Both sects of Pure Land Buddhism, but especially the True Pure Land sect, were remarkable for their efforts to democratize the Buddhist faith by making salvation attainable to all, and were thus very popular outside the educated elite. That same was true for our final subject today, Nichiren Buddhism, named after the monk who founded it. Nichiren is a somewhat later figure than our other subjects today, born into a samurai family in 1222 in Awa province, now a part of Chiba prefecture on the eastern end of the greater Tokyo metro area. That's important for his history in a lot of ways, because by the time Nichiren was an adult, the advent of the Zen and Pure Land traditions had done a lot to shake up the Buddhist establishment and spread Buddhist ideas outside of the aristocracy, particularly among wealthier farmers and the lower levels of the samurai class. In addition, the religious monopolies of the great temples of Kyoto and Nara had already been broken. This groundwork would be very important because it would create fertile ground for Nichiren. Nichiren would enter a local temple as a child that belonged to the Tendai sect, and before long he would come to stand out for his intellectual acumen and deep interest in religion. The monks thus arranged for the boy to study where else but in Ryakuji atop Mount Hiei, the headquarters of the Tendai sect, and a natural destination for such a promising young child. However, before long, Nichiren's interests began to diverge from the other Tendai sect monks. He was not interested in some abstract, otherworldly salvation, but in a this-worldly salvation which would both spiritually aid individuals and help all of Japan as a collective whole. This interest dovetailed nicely with Amidism and Pure Land Buddhism, and initially he was drawn to this, at this point, still pretty novel sect. However, by his own later recollection, he began to doubt the effectiveness of the Nenbutsu practice and sought insights by means of a deep textual study of the sutras, the classic holy texts of Buddhism. And here, Nichiren did find a candidate for his salvation in the form of a religious text known as the Renge-kyo, or Lotus Sutra. Now, the Lotus Sutra is enormously difficult as a text to do any justice to. Just for context, I am the kind of person personally who occasionally reads the Talmud for pure personal interest, and I find the Lotus Sutra nigh impenetrable. To be fair, I have some cultural context for the former I don't have for the latter, but even so, I think that gives you some idea of how complicated this text can be. Speaking broadly, the Lotus Sutra is an exploration of various methods of salvation and how they can be attained, and how all of this fits into a wider cosmology of Mahayana Buddhism. Nichiren found in this text an explanation for the nature of the universe and for the path to salvation within it. Eventually, he came to believe the power of the text was such that the title itself, the Lotus Sutra, possessed a kind of power, such that chanting praise of its name, Namu Myoho Renge-kyo, roughly I take refuge in the mystic dharma of the Lotus Sutra, was a pathway to enlightenment and salvation. Nichiren came to view himself as almost a divinely ordained prophet sent to carry this vision of Lotus Sutra-centric Buddhism through Japan, and took it upon himself to publicly and very forcefully attack competing sects of Buddhism like Zen, Tendai, Shingon, and Pure Land for distorting the truth of Buddhism and harming the people as a result. Eventually, he made his way to Kamakura to try and convince the shogunate to accept his new interpretation of Buddhism, which by this point had become highly syncretic, incorporating aspects of Shinto, particularly the notion that the gods of Japan were also gods of the correct Buddhist path, which is to say, his path. If the shogunate did not accept his teaching, he predicted dire disasters to come. Needless to say, this vision of disaster and of radically upending the religious order of the country did not make Nichiren a lot of friends, and it didn't gain much traction in the Kamakura government. Nichiren was exiled twice for his behavior, and once he was almost executed, spared according to his own account only by a divine miracle. Still, his radical vision did find followers, particularly among disaffected social classes, to whom his vision of a radical reshaping of the social order appealed. And his prophecy, that without his teachings the shogunate would fall into instability, seemed to come true, as over the coming decades it was plagued by yet more internal instability as well as 2 invasions from the continent, about which more next week. As a result, Nichiren began to build a base of followers even in his exile, the basis of the Nichiren sect of Buddhism and its various offshoots, the largest of which is the Soka Gakkai movement. And if you're sensing a theme here, that's intentional. Across all these evolutions of Japanese Buddhism during the medieval period, there is a consistent through line. This is what I've been calling the democratization of Japanese Buddhism, the opening of the religion to new methods of access. This is why medieval Japanese Buddhism matters, why it's worth taking a whole episode to talk about. These sects were instrumental in taking a religion that had already been in Japan for half a millennium and change, and bringing it beyond elite circles, making Buddhism into not just an aristocratic Japanese religion, but a Japanese religion. It is not a coincidence that when we look in the future at the Buddhism of, say, the shoguns of subsequent periods, or the warrior class more broadly, or the townsmen of the future periods of Japanese history, the great majority belong to one of these sects or their offshoots. Now, going forward, we're not going to spend that much time on Buddhism for quite a while, simply because there's a lot else to cover, but I wanted to make sure we told this story, because without it, I don't think you can really understand the religious landscape as it came to exist in Japan. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network at patreon.com/facingbackward. Special thanks to those who have given at our shoutout tier: Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Karen Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Rushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, and Anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sai, Gil, Leslie Ikuta, Trash Taste Enjoyer, Harrison Reese, Robbie Martin McAvoy, Inoue Enryo's Ghostbusters, NihongoKaizen.com, Shimao Toshio's History of Japonesia podcast, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish I Catch Are Rhodes Scholars compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for the Mongol invasions of Japan.